Hi, I'm Michael, and this is California. And it's no secret that over the last year or so, people across the country have needed help. Help to pay for their rent, help to pay for their food, help to take care of their children who have been stuck at home as work and school has been closed down. This is especially true for low-income Americans who work in the hardest hit industries like restaurants and services and entertainment. In response, the U.S. government had and continues to turn on the money printers to create massive social programs and give out tens of thousands of dollars to millions of Americans in cash and tax credits. Let's be clear, this was necessary to help folks to cover their day-to-day expenses and to make sure that their ends meet. But as the saying goes, free money is often the most expensive. Because despite the government's efforts to pay for these social benefits via taxation, there is another hidden tax called inflation that has started to tick up, and if it continues, will affect everybody and hurt low-income Americans more than anybody else. So today we are talking about the everybody tax, also known as inflation, and how it may affect low to middle income Americans for possibly a generation to come. Now, this is your daily dose. And before we get to it, if you like this information, if you find it interesting, if you find it helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you can get updates when our newest and most informative videos become available. So today let's start by talking about what is inflation. Inflation is basically when the money in your pocket becomes less valuable over time. This can happen for a variety of complex reasons, but the reasons most relevant today is because there is so much money being printed, circulated, and not being backed by production. A perfect example of inflation is in the cost of a candy bar. There's something called the Hershey Bar Index. Yeah, it's a real thing, where they have tracked the price of a Hershey bar over the last 100 years. Since the bar has basically not really changed much over that time frame, the change in price can be tracked to show how inflation works. For example, in the 1970s, you could buy a standard Hershey's chocolate bar for 10 cents. But in 2009, that roughly the same size candy bar was $1.10. The candy bar hasn't gotten any bigger and it hasn't gotten any tastier. It's basically the same candy bar. But now, or in 2009, we were actually paying 1,000% more for it because of the inflation. The value that the dollar has, we have in our banks and in our pockets, has decreased. So we have to spend more of them on that exact same candy bar. If we think about it today, as the government has printed trillions and trillions of dollars, rightly I might add, this effect is already accelerating though. We see it in the cost of food, in the cost of gas, in the cost of housing, and the cost of basically everything. These prices have all skyrocketed in the last year, some because of basic supply and demand, but also because so much money has been printed and the value of the dollar has decreased. Another example of this in history was a king in the Malian Empire in the 1300s named Mansa Musa. He was reported to be one of the wealthiest people who ever lived. He had Scrooge McDuck levels of gold, and he wasn't afraid to spend it. On one of his journeys to Cairo, to show his generosity, he decided to heap gold upon pretty much anybody he came across. Beggars got handfuls of gold, shopkeepers, doormen, porters, food vendors, they all got silly amounts of gold for their services. This continued until Mansa Musa had poured the equivalent of $1.5 billion of gold into the pockets of the people of Cairo. Now, you would think this would enrich the city and it would mean much improved lives for their inhabitants, but much the opposite happened. In fact, the economy crashed and didn't even recover for 10 years because with so much gold available, the value of everybody's gold was worth less. It got to the point that it took a full gold bar to buy something as simple as a basket of fruit, or you'd have to tip your taxi driver with the equivalent of $1,000 worth of gold. The point is that there was so much gold put into the city in such a short period of time that it decreased the value of all the gold in the system. This is potentially what is happening right now as the US government pours trillions of dollars into the American system. Although it seems inflation is not good, it's also not 100% bad. There are some benefits to having small amounts of inflation, and it's a normal part of an economy that is growing to have some inflation. But it's when the amount of money grows so quickly that things start to get out of hand. This happened previously in the US, like back in the 70s and 80s. For example, my aunt, she bought a house in the early 80s and her interest rate was at 15%, which is laughable right now when the average interest rate on a mortgage is just around 3%. Additionally, for those folks who have a real assets, things like real estate, gold, stocks, it means that those dollar values for those goods is also going to go up as we see happening right now. Furthermore, people who have established debt, for example, like a 3% mortgage right now, if inflation increases back up to 15%, it means they will get to pay their monthly mortgage with those inflated 15% dollars rather than the more valuable 3% dollars. So they're basically getting a steep discount on their mortgage. Undoubtedly, it is obvious that the winners in this inflation situation are those people who have physical assets that have value that rise with inflation. Spoiler alert, that means the biggest winners are going to be the wealthy. Now, just because these inflationary pressures affect the dollar equally, no matter who's holding it, it doesn't mean it affects everybody fairly. In fact, the biggest losers from inflation are younger people, retired people, and people who hodl cash. This could be the savers who are just keep piling cash into their savings accounts with a 0.001% interest rate. As the inflation rate goes up, it means that the body of cash as a whole begins to lose its value faster. Also, people just getting into the employment market and students whose student loan interest rates are upset partially by inflation. This could also be retirees who have a fixed interest rate value on their retirement investments. Because if the cost of inflation continues to rise, but their income stays the same, it again leaves them in a situation where they start to run out of money faster than they had initially planned for. Lastly, the hardest hit populations by inflation are those low-income folks who have to continually spend a larger portion of money that they're receiving in benefits on things like daily basics like food and gas, housing, and utility. As inflation goes up, these necessities of life also begin to increase in cost. And even with things like the cost of living adjustment, that's the COLA, for folks on pensions and SSI and SSDI and Social Security retirement, it doesn't always account for and cover those unanticipated price spikes. So I think that over the last year, the government made the right choice to substantially bump up the cash it's putting into the pockets of Americans as a whole. It helped out the wealthy and the business owners with things like PPP loans and tax cuts, and normal Americans with things like stimulus checks, tax credits, unemployment, and increased the social safety nets. But the decision to do this is going to have consequences that we're already starting to see. To make matters worse, though, despite seeing inflation on a day-to-day basis, the current government and the Federal Reserve Bank are coming out with inflationary numbers that seem to be far undercutting the actual increase in the cost of goods and services. Now, this is probably in the hopes to try to avoid a panic that would only make the whole situation worse. In doing this, though, and having official numbers that do not reflect the actual increase in the cost of goods, it means that things like the cost of living adjustment, that's the COLA for folks on federal benefits and pensions, will not increase enough to cover the cost of those day-to-day items. Unfortunately, like many things in this economy, inflation is going to have a beneficial effect for those wealthy Americans who have assets and will have a potentially devastating effect on the lower income Americans who don't. Now, this has been your Daily Dose, and I hope that you found it interesting or helpful or at least useful. And if you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you can get updates when our newest and most informative videos become available. So that's it for me, and for California, I'm Michael, wishing you a happy, healthy day.